Hello everybody, I'm Chris Callahan, also known as Mr. C, and today we're going to talk about open files. I'll give you a little warning here. I'm going to throw some jargon at you. I'm going to throw some big words at you, and it's not very important that you remember all of it, but I should give it to you anyway, and I promise to you that at the end of learning all of these big words, or not learning them maybe, it will be useful. It will be a very useful tool, especially to help your rooks. So here we go. Files are these vertical lines on a chessboard. These are called files, and we usually name them after the letters that are at the bottom of the board here. So this is the E file because there's the E, this is the F file, and so on and so forth. There are three kinds of files. There are open files, there are closed files, and there are semi-open files. And we have some of each here. A closed file is a file with two kinds of pawns on it, both a white pawn and a black pawn. An open file is a file that has no pawns on it. No white pawns, no black pawns, no pawns of any color. A semi-open file, or a half-open file, is a file that has one color pawn, but not the other one. So why do we need to know all that? Well, you don't necessarily need to remember the names, as long as you remember what it is and why it's important. The reason we need to know about open files is because rooks love them. Let me put a rook on a closed file, like the B file, and I'm going to put another rook on an open file. Which rook would you say is happier? Clearly the one on the open file, right? And what about half open files? Well, if I put a black rook on the open file, he's very happy because there's no black pawn. The white rook doesn't care as much because there's still a pawn in his way. This is why open files and closed files and half open files are very important to be able to recognize. So we put our rooks on open files, easy enough. And sometimes you will play a game, and in the natural course of the game, you'll trade some pawns off. The pawns get taken one way or another, and you will have open files. But not always. Sometimes you don't have any. What do you do in that situation? So for example, the position you're looking at is the sort of position that I see a lot of beginners get into, and they get very confused and they're not sure what to do. So we tell beginners in the opening, you're supposed to castle your king. Done. These kings are castled. Supposed to have a pawn in the center. They got that going. Supposed to get knights and bishops in. Here are my knights and bishops. So all these pieces are in. So, but what do we do now? When I'm looking at this position, the one thing that really jumps out at me is the rooks. The rooks are really not doing everything that they could be doing, so we need to get them in the game. But of course, the problem is we don't have any open files, so there's no obvious place to put our rooks. So if you find yourself in a position where you don't have any open files and your rooks don't have any good squares to go to, you will simply have to make those open files yourselves. So I'm going to change the position a little bit. I'm going to take everything off but the rooks just to make this as simple as possible. In this position here, there is one move, if I'm playing white, that is just screaming to be played. It seems like such a great move just at a glance. And that move is pawn to f4. We call these moves, these sorts of moves, pawn breaks. And they're called pawn breaks because one way or the other, you are going to get this pawn off the board. And I know it may seem strange to want to get one of my own pieces off the board, but the rook is demanding it. And I don't actually lose the pawn. I'm just going to trade it off. So there's really a couple of ways this can go for black. Black could take the pawn, and then we take back and we have our open file. But what if black doesn't take the pawn? Well, if black doesn't take the pawn, we take black's pawn. And again, here is my open file. Let me change the position just slightly here to show you something that you need to know about. The pawn break in the previous position went very well because the pawn I was breaking against could move. But if it can move, it causes problems. Here's what I mean. If I play the same pawn to f4 move here, black has a way to be very tricky and not play along. Do you see it? Yeah, the move he can play is pawn to e4. And if you remember before, I was going to get my open file one way or the other, but when black just slips right past here, that f-pawn stays on the board, and it's not as clear. So that's just something you should keep in mind as you try to make open files for your rook. The rook is kind of an unusual piece in that way. Like, the way that you get a bishop into the game is usually moving the bishop. The way that you get a knight into the game is moving the knight. But the way you get a rook into the game is often moving a pawn, or more specifically, moving a pawn out of the way of the rook so that it can get into the game. Well, I think that's all there is to say about open files. I hope you'll remember all this and look for ways to make your rooks happy in the games that you play, and look for ways to give them open files. See you later. Bye.